have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Michèle Lamont all the way from Harvard to give her talk, Inequality and Bridging Group Boundaries Through Narratives of Hope. Now, anyone who has been taught by me will be familiar with Professor Lamont's comment that there are no good and bad techniques of data collection. There are only good and bad questions and stronger and weaker ways of using each method. So at least now you'll have the chance to hear Professor Lamont talking about her work herself rather than having it through me. Now, by means of a brief biography, Professor Lamont is a professor of sociology and of African and African American studies and the Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard University. She served as the 108th president of the American Sociological Association in 2016 to 17, and she chaired the Council for European Studies from 2006 to 2009. She is also the recipient of a 1996 John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, 2014 Gutenberg Research Award, and the 2017 Erasmus Prize for her contributions to the social sciences in Europe and the rest of the world. She is also the recipient of honorary doctorates from 5 countries, including Canada, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK. Professor Lamont is the author or co-author of a dozen books and edited volumes, and over 100 articles and chapters on a range of topics, including culture and inequality, racism and stigma, academia and knowledge, social change and successful societies, and qualitative methods. Professor Lamont is the director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard, and is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow for 2019 to 21. She also spent 2019 to 20 at the Russell Sage Foundation. She's working on a book on social change and repertoires of hope to be published by Simon & Schuster in the US and Penguin in the UK, which we are all very much looking forward to. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to you now, Michèle, to give your presentation.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to see you again. And I'm sorry I cannot visit you in Cambridge in person. It would have been wonderful to have a chance to meet new colleagues there, but we do what we can. So as Ali mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about the book I'm currently working on. And I'm going to talk to you about a portion of the book in which also involves 2 graduate students. I'll give you a little bit of a sampling of what the book is about by talking to you about different sections of the book. And I'm going to focus specifically on the place of diversity in the book. So I have written quite a bit over the last few years on questions of resilience and recognition. And now I'm focusing on the anti-stigmatization part of my research agenda, with a focus on recognition. And a driving question is really, where does recognition come from? Who produces it? And you will see that I'm approaching this as a cultural sociologist by looking at who are the people who are producing destigmatizing representations of groups. So this is a tentative title for the book. We will see what happens with it. And this is the team that has been involved in the project, who have been working with me over the last 2 years. So the book really focuses on developing a sociology of recognition by looking at the daily actions of ordinary people and agents of change that are addressing what I call the recognition gap. So the poster of the person on the right, this person is Zachary Drucker, a trans person who has been centrally involved in the TV show Transparent, which features a middle-class man, middle-aged man too, who has 3 children, who decides late in life that he wants to portray himself as a woman. So the issue, and the t-shirt says, "I see you," and "I see you" is something that Gen Zs are very fond of, the idea of recognizing people for who they are. People want to be seen. So this is a recurring theme in the current debates among Gen Zs, and you will see that it is at the center of understanding what recognition gaps are about and how to address them. So here I draw on 2 papers that I have published over the last 2 years. my presidential address to the American Sociological Association titled Addressing the Recognition Gap, as well as a lecture, the annual lecture I gave to the British Journal of Sociology 2 years ago, From Having to Being, which offers a kind of diagnosis of the current moment for American society and proposes ways forward. So this is really what this is about, with a focus specifically on how to develop an empirical sociology of recognition and stigmatization to broaden the cultural citizenship of members of our society to the largest member. So we have an enormously well-developed sociology of distribution of resources in sociology. And the first paper claims that we're nowhere as far along where it comes to an empirically grounded and cumulative sociology of recognition and stigmatization. I know that there's important work being produced right now in the UK on these very questions, and even the bridge between British or continental and American sociology of recognition and stigmatization has yet to be accomplished, and it's something I'd like to do. But so the key concept, you will probably be familiar with Axel Honneth's definition of recognition, a social act by which the positive social worth of an individual or group is affirmed and acknowledged by others. So this is a cultural production in the sense that it involves processes of valuation of groups that have been undervalued or stigmatized. And I'm focusing precisely on the work of valuation, which is often invisible. And the counterpart is stigmatization, a concept we're all very familiar with, which consists in qualifying negatively identities and differences. And the approach I take to these Asian concepts is a focus on cultural processes, which is a process of collective or interactive meaning making, which unfolds through everyday life and involve intersubjective definition of reality that is coming to a point where people can share definition of reality as real. And if you're interested, and this is an approach that is developed in the paper that is cited here, which is very much about the blind spots of the current literature on inequality, which is focused still on the distribution aspect of inequality. So I would say that this is the paper that really anchors the project theoretically. But since the book I'm going to talk about is a book for a larger audience, it's the first time I tried to write a trade book. All this will not really be forefronted in the book. If you want to know what the theoretical rationale for the project, you have to look elsewhere. So one of the ideas that ground the book is really that recognition matters. It's not only a question of making people feel good. So think about, for instance, LGBTQ youth that are kicked out of the house by their parents, which may result in homelessness and poverty. This is a case where stigmatization has material consequences. But it matters, you think of racial disparity in health, or for African Americans in the context of the pandemic, the very unequal impact that the pandemic has had on the health of African Americans. The list could go on and on. There are many ways in which politics, in which stigmatization affect people's life condition independently of their impact on material condition. So all this to say, this is a serious topic, not one to be taken lightly. So the book really is structured in two parts. The first part offers the direct diagnosis concerning the current moment. The focus is American society, but it's much broader to the extent that there's so many similarities between the US and other advanced industrial societies. So, and I think many of the problems are converging, and some of the solutions should be converging as well. So this paper, From Having to Being, basically is the summary of the diagnosis, which focuses on this moment of, pre-pandemic moment of maximal inequality, where a neoliberal conception of the self has become absolutely hegemonic and is diffused by the media, with by, for instance, entertainment industry, which presents the life of the upper middle class as the most desirable way to live, and which feeds, very few working class characters are available on entertainment television, and those that are there are presented as clowns or as stupid. So many have written about the loss of recognition for the working class, the loss of dignity for the people below the bottom 50% of the population. And this has fed a mental health crisis for the upper middle class as well as for the working class. So this happens in the context where neoliberalism has become hegemonic, especially over the last few years. You can see here in terms of the appearance of themes related, or the word neoliberalism, in the LexisNexis data bank since 2015. 2015 was the moment where the term was used most often. So far from being a thing of the past, it's still very much a thing of the present, and it's equally present in the US and in Europe. And I'm focusing specifically on the cultural aspects of neoliberalism, which we have developed in a book that I've co-edited with the political scientist Peter Hall, and on what neoliberalism tells us we should be as human beings, with a focus on self-reliance, competitiveness, material success, social status, and meritocracy. So none of this will be news for us sociologists, but I think in terms of population, a broad readership, it's important to capture this in terms of setting the scene and, presenting, of course, the Trump moment as the epitome of, Trump being the epitome of self-presentation of this neoliberal self. So it goes hand in hand with a very important crisis in mental health in the middle class. One indicator of this is what's happening with college students in the US, where you can see the quite dramatic increase in the number of undergrad who feel overwhelmed. And, of course, the middle class is overrepresented in this group. So overwhelmed because of the pressures that their parents are putting on them to succeed according to this neoliberal scripts of self. So people are simply feeling that they are not matching the parental expectations. They have to face helicopter parenting, a lot of pressure from their parent to live up to the American dream, while at the same time, many people think the American dream is not very attractive anymore. It doesn't correspond to the kind of life that they want to lead. And they don't believe that it is achievable for them. And we will see data about this in a few minutes when it comes to the Gen Zs. But the second part of the book focuses on solution, and it's the part that I want to focus more on today. And I focus specifically on the creation of alternative cultural narrative. What are the sources of hope? Where do people turn to find sources of hope in this fairly bleak environment where the American dream, the primary source of hope for Americans for much of the 20th century, is now perceived as out of reach by many. In surveys, many people still say that they embrace the American dream, but they define it in increasingly vague terms, such as, I want to have a good family. So the specific objectives of reaching economic prosperity is less salient and seems out of reach for a growing number of people. But as a cultural sociologist, I'm really interested in tracing who produces the new sources of hope and how. And in what ways are they, for today, I'm focusing on, in what ways are they leading us toward embracing a society that extends recognition to the largest number. And how is this achieved? So the book focuses on what I call pluralistic criteria of worth, which is the idea that our worth as human being is less exclusively anchored in having our capacity to accumulate wealth or to achieve socioeconomic success, and more in the notion that there's many ways of being worthy. And this is a part of the repertoires of hope that are being diffused. And also this notion of everyday cosmopolitanism, the notion that we are all equal as human beings for a wide range of reasons, which might go from, we're equal as human to we're all children of God. So I'm partly interested in tracing how these notions of everyday cosmopolitanism are produced by what I called agents of change, but also are produced by ordinary people, in particular Gen Zs, who we have interviewed. And finally, I'm focusing on how groups that have been historically stigmatized become destigmatized. So these are the various books that studies the theoretical underpinning of the project. And I'm drawing specifically on this paper that I co-authored with some former graduate students, which focuses on how three different groups that have been stigmatized are experiencing or not experiencing destigmatization. So these are the three groups that we looked at in this paper. People living with HIV/AIDS, that's the group that has been most successfully destigmatized. African Americans and people who are labeled as obese, that's the group that has not become destigmatized at all. And we traced through an analysis of the secondary literature all the factors that have contributed or not to the destigmatization of these groups, and that's how we came up with this path analysis of the process of destigmatization, which emphasizes the capacity of social actors, social movements, people I define as agents of change, we'll see in a second who they are, to draw on existing ideologies in the environment and expert knowledge to engage in destigmatizing action. So I'm not going to be able to go in great depth with this, but this is just FYI as background. So the data on which this project draws is three type of data. Most importantly, we did interviews with a large number of agents of change who are cultural intermediaries or are acting in a fairly large number of cultural fields that are oriented toward social change. And we also did interviews with Gen Zs who are young people between the age of 18 and 22 in the northeast of the US and in the Midwest, mostly middle class sample, but it also includes a working class sample, people who are in community colleges. And finally, to be able to tap the transformation of relationship that people have with the American dream, we re-interviewed people that my colleagues and I had interviewed for our book, Getting Respect, in 2008. African Americans, working class and middle class. So a lot of the project is concerned with the public sphere and the shared scripts of self that are being produced in the public sphere. So the conceptualization of the public sphere we use is quite different from that of Habermas, which is now a little bit dated. We draw specifically on the two papers that are cited at the bottom of this slide, which are new papers trying to update what does the public sphere looks like today in 2019. 2020, and with a focus on, of course, social media, but also the professionalization of social movement and the emergence of other types of institutions such as foundations and nonprofit organizations and think tanks that are now playing a very central role in in populating the public sphere, which was not the case 50 years ago when Habermas wrote his, well, more than 50, now it's 70 since he wrote this in the early 60s. So we end up with something like this, various groups that are contributing to populating this public sphere. And this is the basis on which I selected the people we're going to interview. It involves, and this is, I think, pretty rare, we were able to reach out to a large number of people who are directly involved in the creation of the most popular shows produced by platforms such as Netflix, but also by other outlets. So you have on the list the director of The Handmaid's Tale, or some of the key actors of Queer Eye. Last week we interviewed the co-writer for Black Panther, which has been one of the largest grossing movie worldwide over the last few years, the 9th largest film ever. So these films are important in part because many of them are promoting visions of diversity and inclusion that are centered on, for instance, sexual identity or gender. So they are or race and ethnicity or religion. So they are many of them are in fact promoting forms of equality, or celebrating recognition in a pretty explicit fashion. And a lot of our interviews have to do with what the showrunners, the writers, are trying to do in how do they convey in the specific medium that they're using the meanings about who belongs. So we consider them as agents of change that have a very wide influence. And we also have here women like Channing Dunghae, who is responsible for content at Netflix at the global level. So she's very close to people like Shonda Rhimes and Ava DuVernay, who've had enormous cultural influence. We also interviewed the philanthropists who are making a lot of this work possible. Leah Hunt Hendricks is one of the heirs of the Hunt fortune from Texas, very close to the Bush family, and she is behind Black Lives Matter, Me Too. She's among the progressive high net worth individuals that have been funding a lot of the social change, including what has happened, the mobilization against police violence last summer. So this is something most people don't know, that in fact, there's a very strong connection between these social movements and a lot of very progressive foundations that are making their work possible and really raising the profile and the visibility of these movements. And then you also have social impact investing and a big movement for inclusive capitalism, which includes people like Mariana Mazzucato at LSE, who are trying to redefine what capitalism is about, so that it can be more inclusive. And you have Sister Barbara Stelly, who is the Mother Superior of the Order of the Sacred Heart, that does an enormous amount also in terms of, in the name of God, promoting a more inclusionary society and using their enormous capital. There's something like 250 sisters that are still part of this order, but there's over 20,000 people working for the order, and they are using their resources to take risks that no one else would take. So it's really a multi-dimensional world. I'm including social impact investing in here to say that it's not only people who would be viewed as lefties. There's a very wide range of motivation for the work that is being done. And we have stand-up comics, and so the book really starts with so this is just a little part of the people we've interviewed, but I think this is partly interesting because we bring together people who directly produce the public sphere on a daily basis in American society, coming from various segments of the public sphere. People like Cornel West, for instance, who's a very important source of inspiration for the radical left. So to tell you a little bit more about what this recognition is about, let's focus on a specific segment of the sample who are Black and queer photographers I've interviewed, as well as an art critic, Sarah Lewis, and others who have engaged in the process of valuation of the work of these photographers. So I've interviewed Catherine Opie, who, well, this is another one. What these people are doing is, as you interview them, they say that they spend their life trying to provide a three-dimensional depiction of stigmatized group, and they provide a dignified and humanized depiction of who they are. They want to make visible people who are typically visible, invisible, or represented in a way that is mostly negative. And they give people the lenses through which they can see themselves, see their own representation in the way that they would want to see themselves represented. So these are all acts of recognition that are accomplished through the work. So Catherine Opie is a queer photographer and a gatekeeper. She serves on the Andy Warhol Foundation board and many other boards. And she's been, when I interviewed her, she talked about the ways in which she wants to create a familial intimacy between the audience and the people who she depicts. But the people she depicts are people who are rarely seen in a positive light. In particular, she's part of the letter community in Los Angeles, which is normally depicted very negatively. So of this community, she says, that this letter community was being represented negative in the main, that she didn't like the way they were being represented. They think that we are child molesters and everything that's attached to that. We've had a bad rap. That was probably the biggest reason for doing the portraits. I decided to do a body of work that was about being really out and being out about my sexuality and being into S&M and letter stuff, instead of just showing the tattoos and the piercing and the markings on the body. I wanted to do a series of portraits that were incredibly noble. So in other interviews, she talks about, the affection that, and, the connection between the people that she wanted to depict, to humanize them and dignify them. So we find something quite similar. Over here. Come on. Why is it not moving? In the work of Hank Thomas Willis, who did an enormous project called Question Bridge, which depicts African-American men living in 12 different cities who are being interviewed as they answer the question, what does it mean to be a Black man? And it's a video project. And what this project does is represent a huge diversity of who Black men think they are. And the takeaway is basically that it's a figment of the European imagination, and it's such a diverse group that most of what they have in common is the stereotypes that they encounter. So the video that Hank Thomas Willis produced, and circulated through many museums, and it really aimed to be at the center of a campaign of education that had an enormous impact. So if you want to look for it, you can, go to this website here by searching a Question Bridge, and you will see. But this does not come from nowhere. In fact, it was enabled by the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which is led by a man named Sean Dove, who has been backed by the Open Society Foundations since 2008, and he has now created a foundation that, in general, supports the promotion of Black male achievement, and has been behind very visible programs such as My Brother's Keeper. And the goal of this foundation was really to try to present Black male not as a problem, but to focus, as the second quote says, not on what is wrong with them, with Black people being the face of poverty or the face of crime, but by defining people by their aspirations instead. So the focus is on narrative, very explicitly so. And this is just one of a great many organizations that have as an objective to produce social change by transforming narrative. And that's really one of the central focus of the book. And thanks to the funding that the project received from the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, they were able to use the video to have conversation in a great many cities, in schools, in museums, around the stereotypes of the Black men, with the goal of having young Black people engage with the stereotype and discuss how to, the problems with it, and also to raise awareness and to provide recognition to Black male in the US about the group. So this is really a direct intervention with enormous trickle effects in terms of trying to transform representation at the macro social level. It's impossible to measure the outcome, but one can certainly talk about the number of events that were organized and how many people attended, etc. So I use this concept of recognition chain to talk about how narrative is produced through the collaboration of funders and cultural producers. But also you have art critics such as my colleague, Sarah Lewis, who writes a lot about Black photography and the transformation of representation. So the project here is a little bit inspired by, as you're probably all aware, STS focus on chains of collaborations in the creation of facts. So now switching gear a little bit, I want to talk about the work that Gen Zs are doing in creating change and how also they draw on the cultural repertoires that are made available to them as they are thinking about the kind of society that they live in. And I think this group is partly important because it has been at the center of important social movements over the last few months, and they have mobilized massively in the context of the last election. Here I'm drawing on two papers that I'm in the process of developing with two graduate students. I would have invited them to present with me this morning, but for the fact that it's pretty early in the US now. So one of them is the first paper is on the cultural repertoires on which they draw to make sense of their environment. And the other one is on how they experience social resilience and the role of diversity, recognition, and inclusion in fostering social resilience in this group and in how they understand social resilience. So again, why focus on this group? Because they are now very central social actors in the current context. And they are also experiencing growing inequality in the pandemic in a much more dramatic way than many other people. They have not yet really started their adult life. They're in the process of, transitioning toward their first job. And it's very difficult for them to project themselves into the future since their group is just extremely unstable. At the same time, they are mobilizing and they are, as you are certainly aware, extremely critical of the boomers and the Gen X for having inherited very positive social conditions that they have not been mobilized sufficiently in creating social change when they could. So the description of this group, as you will find it in the media, we're studying Gen Z being very aware that it's a product of marketing experts. It's a category, it's a demographic category that is only loosely defined. So, but at the same time, it's a term that is so widely used in the media that it is affecting how Gen Zs are thinking about them. They now have clear scripts about their cohort and who they are and who they want to be. So we know that they are largely rejecting, they are skeptical of the American dream, and instead are focusing on values such as diversity, sustainability, and authenticity as alternative values around which they want to organize their lives. So a lot more could be said about this, but I'll skip. And that this is a number of references to the Gen Zs and millennials in the media. So you can see how it is very prominent, especially since 2019 for the Gen Zs. So whether or not the group exists for real, it exists as an intersubjective reality, even if it is difficult to capture exactly what distinguishes it. So the first paper focuses on the braided repertoires, and the argument is, as we are interviewing them about the kind of society they live in and the kind of society they would like to live in, they draw on 4 different cultural repertoires that are available in their world. They are not entirely wedded to the American dream and neoliberalism yet. These scripts are still very much present in their lives. They are embracing hard work, persistence, personal responsibility, a lot of the notions that have been historically associated with, well, American capitalism, but also the American dream. But unlike the generation of the boomers and their parents, they're very, very attuned to the therapeutic ethos with its focus on mental health, on living in the present and maximizing individual well-being. So it's not necessarily focused on transforming society as much as it is on protecting themselves and ensuring that they're doing okay, probably as a response to the important mental health crisis that this generation is facing. And at the same time, they are engaging with ordinary cosmopolitanism, embracing the notion that, you know, you can be who you should be. If you want to be queer, be queer. This is not the criteria by which one should determine people's worth as individual. They value authenticity, the ability of people to be truthful to who they want to be. And they also mention often what we call the Gen Z Cohort Narrative, with its focus on inclusion, diversity, and empathy, emphasizing the ways in which they are different from the boomers. So what we argue in the paper is that these 4 different cultural repertoires are braided. They abandoned some elements of the repertoire, embrace others, and to focus on the elements that are here in the lower part of this table. And we argue in the paper that recognition of a plurality of life path and emphasizing how moral character, which is universally available, not something that you have to buy, and participation in your community is central to how they understand the worth of people. So here I have a couple of quotes that illustrate this. I'm going a little bit faster now since I realize I've already spoken for 40 minutes, but it's really about, you know, the first quote you don't have, it's an anti-assimilationist perspective on how people should lead their life. You know, they're saying that the American dream should be about people being who they want to be, pursuing their freedom. They should not abandon their culture to go play golf on a Sunday or go to a Christian church. So live and let live, be who you want to be. But it's very important to be passionate about whatever you're doing and to work hard at whatever passion you have. So a notion of dedicating yourself. So a celebration of pluralism and anti-assimilationism. And yet there's a strong focus on the idea that moral character is what should ground our judgment about who is worthy, as opposed to socioeconomic status. So that, you know, being nice is also something that is extremely salient. Being able to treat people as decent human beings is central in how they talk about the kind of people they value. So this is a form of everyday cosmopolitanism, the notion that we can all be worthy if we abide by basic standards of morality. So it's also a very localistic understanding of worth, and one that is anchored in everyday interaction. And also in communal participation, that people should be involved. The second quote is really, if people are dying around you, how do you dare not have an opinion? We have to take a stand on the kind of society that we live in, and this is not something that should be optional. So this paper argues that in the way they talk about the kind of society they would like to live in, they are explicitly exclusive toward those who have alternative values and political beliefs. So here, keeping in mind that the people we interview are in college, we're also studying a specific class culture, and one that draws very strong boundaries against, for instance, those who support Donald Trump. So it's not like we're studying the Gen Zs who are not college educated. We have a very specific slice of this group, and this is a group that defines what they believe in opposition to those who would be more materialistic and less wedded to a vision of what society is that would be more pluralistic. At the same time, among our working class respondents, more of them emphasize the importance of making a living and focusing on the material aspects of life. So there's an implicit exclusion, and this our results overlap with the post-materialist thesis that Ronald Engelhardt had developed. But of course, we go there through a very different path. And the second paper focused on social resilience. The approach to resilience that we have is also one that focuses on cultural processes, the capacity of groups to sustain their well-being in face of challenges, with a focus on the cultural repertoires that people have access to, and the ways in which they can mobilize institutions to improve their resilience. So this is the pathway that is at the center of the paper, with again a focus on the cultural resources that are available, how they have access to these resources through various medium, and how this shapes the scripts of self that develop. And we argue that there's two predominant scripts of self that we were able to identify after coding the data using Atlas TI. And these are both organized around collective identity, adaptation, and future thinking. And you can see all these processes connecting, destigmatizing, including, evolving, recalibrating, etc. So these are the conditions that for social resilience that they talk about, that feed the process of developing social resilience. I'm sorry, I'm probably too ambitious in trying to present all this to you, but I will simply conclude by saying that one of the dimensions of the conditions that feed social resilience is collective identity. And this, again, has to do with the celebration of diversity and recognition, where they are talking about how connecting to your community is essential, developing a sense of interconnectivity, and engaging with your community is really what allows people to be resilient. So this one person, Samantha, says, it's not just about us, it's about our community. That's why I've been very sensitive. Okay, I need to respect my community during the pandemic, during Black Lives Matter. And this may be frustrating and hard, but I want to do this for my kids and my kids' kids, my neighbors, and the elderly people in town. So repeated commitment to responsibility toward others, interconnectedness, which they view as central to building a world that is stronger and building their own social resilience, which is very much in contrast with the individualistic perspective that many would associate with the US. And this also comes with the focus on compassion, empathy, and tolerance. And as you can see, there's a lot of talk about kindness, being kind and respectful. And many people would say this is not at all political. Well, for them, this is very political, because politics is about how you deal with people on a daily basis. So some people would respond, well, social justice is not kindness. Well, a lot of them would say, yes, it is the same thing. So that's a very something that they talk about being part of their generational script. And it involves expanding criteria of worth. So here we reconnect with the very beginning of the talk, with this focus on the plurality of criteria of worth, which are very, very central in how they talk about cultivating resilience. It's more about, what fulfillment and what feeling successful means to you. I think that everyone should be able to have that, to be fulfilled. So it's a very democratic approach to what kind of society they think we should live in, which could be defined pretty much in opposition to the society of maximal inequality that their parents have been experiencing, and which they feel very anxious about how their kids will be managing. So in conclusion, their vision for a more inclusive future would involve orienting their project toward realizing greater collective well-being and a sense of obligation to do their part, which goes through bottom-up activism. So they perceive themselves as an activist generation, which will inform their personal pathways towards social change. So I could talk a little bit about how half of our sample of Gen Zs are people of color. And there are a few differences in terms of whites versus people of color that I could discuss later. So in conclusion, here we have two different sources of change and hope that I've discussed briefly. What I've talked about are the production of recognition by cultural producers. This feeds into a much broader literature on how a national culture of diversity is being produced in the American context. I am sure that in the UK context, you have a parallel literature, and I'd love to know more about it and to think with you about similarities and differences. Certainly, the place of religion is much greater in the British context, given that the centrality of Muslims in the discourse of diversity. And then we saw that Gen Zs are themselves, as cultural producers, drawing on cultural resources around them and rearranging group boundaries at the same time as, this question of social resilience are very much framed by how they talk about diversity and inclusion as conditions for producing, better societies, what they would view as better societies. So I will stop here. I should probably have skipped the last case, but here you are. You get a very broad view of what this book might be about one day. And I look forward to your comments, since I'm still very much in the weed, writing a little bit every day. So I look forward to your input. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michèle. That was such a great talk. And I'm sure that we're all very excited to see the book come out, and also to have some of those sneak peeks for some of the papers that are going to be coming out in the near future. So we have just over half an hour for questions now. If you want to ask questions, you can put them into the chat, or you can raise your hand in the participants panel and I'll try to spot you. So to open it up, Liran says that they have a question. Liran, do you want to open the questions?
Yes. Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. And I think this cultural approach to cultural analysis of where we're at, focusing on generations, is very helpful. I guess my comment and question would turns around some of the ways that your understanding of the concept of recognition, and some of the slippages that might occur when focusing on it too much, because a lot of the things you mentioned, things like community and kindness, these are not inherently cosmopolitan, inclusive concepts. They can easily, and they have been very efficiently used by radical right press in the United States to create this, the groupness of the honest, hardworking white male who wants the original, who wants the community, essentially the white community and white white American values to be respected, and who views social justice movements and minorities and with derision as kinds of disruptors, people who don't respect the common order, who are not kind, who engage in violence, who loot, etc. So there is a kind of sense in which you could say that working with recognition and kindness and these kinds of concepts that are very positive when you speak about them, they very much lend themselves also to polarization and antagonism in society. And in the other direction, what you when you talk about authenticity, authentic values as something very prominent in Generation Z, I mean, that's also quite neoliberal, right? Like the whole Instagram authenticity is something that very much promotes a neoliberal consumption model of life. So perhaps I wonder whether you think there's cause for thinking about these concepts in a more complex way that recognizes the way that it can work both in favor of emancipatory projects such as the one that perhaps you envision, but also in a counter-emancipatory regressive agenda.
Yeah, this is a very good question and very good point. I agree with you. I know of colleagues who are working on how central themes are the object of a tug of war for appropriation between conservatives and progressives in the US, in particular the work of Rob Weiler at, I think it's pronounced Willer, at Stanford, who shows how the themes, he's an experimental psychologist, who shows basically the battle between Republicans and conservatives in appropriating words such as the family, which is one of the sacred cows of American politics. Both countries want to be the country of the party of the family. And I think that probably I'd be interested in knowing what he finds about the words community and kindness. He also finds that, the word American is of course also an object of a tug of war. So I agree with you. This is, framing battles. And I know that in the context, the post-election context now, Republicans are already saying, well, Biden will not be, tough enough to be able to resist the progressive forces of the Democratic Party. So the question of how these words are appropriated by both parties is going to be very, very central. I agree with you also on the concept of authenticity. I mean, the argument that we're making is that a lot of what they are embracing remains neoliberal. At the same time, they define authenticity is often defined in opposition to the profit motive that, people should pursue what is genuinely their passion and inspiration, which would be far more in line with traditional emancipatory projects. But it's also a very individual focus, which would go along with neoliberalism. So I guess the takeaway is that you need to look at these concepts as very much elastic and subject to different frames. But it's very different from the old left, as I knew it when I was students in the 80s or 70s, when, kindness certainly didn't go with the culture of the left, So these are really important changes that we have to recognize. And the idea that if the personal is political, it also goes to the level of how we treat each other as human beings on a daily basis. And the T-shirt that I started with, I am seeing is something very new, and we have to recognize that this is not the old left perspective on what politics is about.
It's a really interesting way to start the Q&A. And just so that everyone has a chance to get their question in, it would be really great if you could just keep your questions to as briefly as possible. Sophie.
And I'll keep my answers short too.
Don't worry about that. Sophie is one of my grad students. Sophie, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much. This was really interesting. To make my question really brief, it's kind of in the research design almost. If you're looking at hope and narratives of change, I was wondering how you kind of reckon with the differences in almost maybe radicalism, if I want to use that word, in the people that you're interviewing, because I've realized that on the one hand, like you have some queer photographers that might be kind of against this, the way that more liberal crews kind of appropriate some of those narratives. And so I was wondering, or just in general, it does seem like, even if we're just looking at Gen Zs in the BLM movement, a lot of very radical ideas like abolition and that kind of stuff was, people seem to have quite a big literacy in them. And like you'd have Gen Z influencers sharing Angela Davis texts. I don't know to the extent of which people read it, but I'm interested in how you reckon with like this and Netflix, or like this and Queer Eye, which is kind of two really opposite ways of thinking change, and like even the idea of inclusive capitalism. So yeah, that was my question.
Yeah, well, I guess the picture that will emerge of the book, from the book, will be one of the pluralism of the world that this public sphere is about, that it can accommodate many different agendas, and maybe also the broader the umbrella, the more powerful it can be, I guess, because a lot of, if the progressive philanthropies are empowering the movement against racial, against police violence, it has a multiplier effect, and a lot of the people I've interviewed work in the world of technology are very interested in scaling up change. And the scaling up of the change requires making alliances with progressives who are controlling those means of production. So I think the picture that would be emerging is one of collaboration across peoples who don't necessarily see eye to eye, but are pushing in a similar direction. So it's not a time for engaging in the narcissism of small differences, but also more to think about what alliances are possible. Yeah. Do I answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Arsene, you've had your hand up for a while. Do you want to ask the next question?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have two questions about the entertainment industry specifically. First, celebrities, which you've discussed, are agents with large amounts of power, obviously. But have you come across during your fieldwork any below the line, so to speak, experts, such as cultural consultants, technical advisors, or dialect coaches who also participate in this industry of cultural change? And my second question is, when we talk about, obviously as sociologists, we study social change and narrative change, but also in Hollywood, social change and narrative change are the concepts that Hollywood professionals use to promote themselves. And basically it's a part of their promotional strategy. And my question is whether you think we should distinguish between these two uses of the concept, and how powerful Hollywood as an industry is really in respect of social change. Thank you.
Yeah. I did not interview a lot of people at the level of operatives, if that's your first question. I did interview one journalist who works for Medium. And Medium is important to the extent that it's a click and bait, operation that many people use. And she worked for Jan, which is one of the, and she was a 40, herself, she was a millennial, and she didn't view herself as someone with authorship. That's probably the main difference. She didn't have a brand, but it was a very good interview in terms of understanding the conditions of production as someone who herself spends a lot of time selecting what's going to be put online and what people are going to be consuming. And there were also people who were a little bit behind the front line. One really interesting person was a guy named Jack Conte, who has created something called Patreon. And Patreon is really something you should look into. It allows a great many artists, video producers to put online their work, and then you become their subscribers. So it has, for instance, enabled something called the Chapo Trap House, which is one of the main medium of the, what is called the dirt bag, the third back left to publicize their work. So extreme left, basically, that normally would have a lot of problem diffusing their work, and they have a huge following on Patreon. So it's a technical tool. It's a platform which has allowed an explosion in pluralism and has allowed a lot of bands to make a living of their work instead of, constantly being at the mercy of the big labels. So there's a component of the book which is about the role of technology in creating pluralism. But these people, they're not talking about narrative change. What is really central around the narrative change that I capture in the book is how the Ford Foundation and other foundations have created a lot of other NGOs whose work it is to engineer narrative change, which means that narrative change is now viewed independently as a source of social transformation, as a counterpart to the redistribution of resources, for instance. So this, I thought, was really important in a context where economists are always viewed as hegemonic because they have the ear of the president, et cetera. Now there's a lot of other points from which change is being created in American society that are directly focused on cultural change. And this, I think, is extremely interesting. As for Hollywood, of course, many people will talk more about the limitations of how much change is being created in Hollywood. At the same time, I personally think that the representation of trans people in shows such as Transparent have been revelatory for a lot of people. So, of course, there's a huge conversations around, how slow changes in representations of people of color, et cetera. But Netflix has people like Channing Dungey at the helm, and powerful actors such as Shonda Rhimes that are truly changing what is being shown. So I don't think that we can dismiss the importance of this.
Great. I'm just now looking at the chat because we have some questions there. This one here is actually a couple of questions packed together. So firstly, they are asking, is there a difference between different cohorts in the narrative and recognition? And secondly, will the trend of deglobalization affect the cultural identity of inequality, especially for immigrants in the US?
I presume the question is about different cohorts among agents of change. Well, I have not looked at the data closely to be able to answer this question yet. It's probably something I need to look at. I think of one respondent who organized a day of strike in Hollywood to get all LGBTQ people to not work, just so that the industry would become aware of how central they are to the whole thing. But he did that in, I think the mid 90s, and now this is very much part of the mainstream, I think, in Hollywood. So I think the battles of the previous generations were not the current battles. So it would probably be worth having a few paragraphs on this. And the second question was about the representations of immigrants and how globalization is influencing. Yes, well, we know that the power of Netflix is because it's global. If Black Panther was the ninth largest grossing, show ever, it's in part because it is portraying a major, it's a Black production. It's about Black people, and it was diffused worldwide. So the international market for Hollywood has a lot to do with what is happening. And we know that I was just reading yesterday, I'm going to show it to you today at noon, at our time, I'm discussing this book by Cassie Pittman, former graduate students, Black Privilege, Modern Middle-Class Blacks, and Credentials and Cash to Spend. So it's about the culture of the Black middle class in the US. And she cites all the literature showing that it's a very cosmopolitan Black middle class that doesn't make a lot of difference between those whose families come from Africa or West Africa or the US. So the fact that the Black middle class is in general very cosmopolitan means that it makes, the integration of immigrants quite easily, at least in the middle class. So I think this is a very interesting question. We need to think about cosmopolitanism as a central ingredient of middle-class culture, just as is cultural omnivorousness. And the question of how this operates differently across classes is absolutely crucial, I think. So,
and another question from the chat comes from Dr. David Lehman. He's asking, can you imagine yourself doing a comparable study among people such as those described by Ali Hochschild in the Mississippi Basin in Louisiana?
Well, I published in 2000 a book titled The Dignity of Working Man, which is very much, it shares some themes with Arlie's book about the ways in which the affronts to their dignity is feeding their racism. So I think Arlie herself would certainly recognize the similarity in the themes. I think she focuses more on empathy. I think she may be more influenced by psychology than I am. I'm focusing more on group boundaries, which is, I think, more cultural, structural in emphasis. She focuses on the rural-urban divide, which I don't. My study was a comparison of Paris working class people, Black and white in New York and white and North African in Paris. And we know that the urban-rural divide is absolutely central to American politics today, which was not at all part of my book. So, and she also tackled in her book the question of the environment, which was not salient when I did my study. The interviews for The Dignity of Working Man go back to '93. So at the time, the environment was simply not salient at all. So.
And of course, in the British Journal of Sociology, you recently published analysis of Trump's electoral speeches, returning to some of those themes from The Dignity of Working Man, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Okay, so Robert, you've had your hand up for a while. Do you want to ask the next question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, very much. Thank you for the talk, Professor Lamont. It's always exciting to hear sociology of emancipation, not just the critical part. But I guess my question goes in the direction of what Boltanski calls the sociology of critique. So I guess it also connects to the first question we discussed, namely in how far we can prevent emancipatory concept ideas to be incorporated by not just, I guess, right-wing groups, but also following Boltanski by capitalism. Because you talked about the neoliberal self. And I guess what Boltanski showed is that creativity was kind of incorporated by capitalism in order to propel this new mode of self. So I guess, my question is, as you may already expect, in how far we can prevent or in how far we can reflect about this process. And I guess the second, maybe also connecting to that question, in how far we can reflect about this threat by when we only take into account the cultural capital. Because I guess this is something, what you did in your talk and possibly also in your paper, is that you focus on the distribution of cultural or symbolic capital, and in how far we must, I guess, this is Savage's critique. I just read his comment on your talk, and I guess he says right now we have to focus on economic capital. I mean, this is the form of capital that's getting distributed very unequally. So I guess, yeah, maybe those two interrelated questions.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that I have read Mike Savage's forthcoming book, where he argues that the economic capital remains very dominant across all advanced industrial societies. And you can show this by looking at the dynamic between the cultural and the economic segments of the dominant class. I think that is convincing, but at the same time, if we want to understand the reproduction of inequality, I mean, you really need to look at the cultural processes. And that's where I think I take a very different path from Bourdieu, because I think Bourdieu remained a kind of, structural thinker, in the sense that he considered, I think you'll think I'm engaging in vulgar Marxism, but I think the logic of, means of production, objective basis for power, is how we approach the combination of various types of capital. And for me, this is very, very different than tracing, process tracing and looking at cultural processes as a form of process tracing, and how they influence how, inequality is reproduced. So I think what we do in our paper, what is missing, is very, very different from what Bourdieu has done in his field analysis. As for Boltanski's point about the capacity of neoliberalism to recuperate sources of emancipation, yeah, I mean, I agree, but at the same time, if you think that path dependency is always unpredictable, change is always open-ended, and I think that's partly the point of our argument about the braiding of forms of cultural repertoires, as expressed in our interviews with Gen Zs. They're not creating everything anew, we never, as Mao Zedong used to say, we never swim in the same river twice. So they are recuperating cultural resources that are available to them, but at the same time, recombining them in a way that allows for novelty. And who would have thought that the forms of, solidarity that are celebrating today are the ones that would become, central 20 years ago, I mean, I think to better understand how social change or cultural change happen, you really have to look into the unexpected bridging of repertoires, a little bit like, the four repertoires that we show converge contain a lot of new, but they also have traction because they build on, themes that were there before. So, I mean, it might be Pollyannish to say what I just said, but at the same time, my sense is that's how things work. The theme, kindness is not social justice, is something that is being discussed now in the American left, which would not have been discussed 20 years ago.
Mm. And I'm just now looking back at the chat because Joe Cotton's got a question here. He says, "Thank you so much for this interesting and comprehensive presentation. Please, could you say a little bit more about the different kinds of Gen Z actors you mentioned towards the end, especially around intentions versus actions, and perhaps how actions are constructed as performative versus authentic?"
I guess that refers to the last slide, which was on people of color. Yeah. And he says performative versus what?
Authentic.
Authentic. I'm not too concerned with these things, in part because I'm very old Durkheimian, as in, the elementary form, in that I think that performance are real. I don't think turtles all the way down. I'm not too concerned. I think a lot of what people express has consequences, and I'm very anti-behavioralist in the opposition between looking at what is said as, simply operating at the level of the semiotics. So concerning the differences between, obviously we don't have any data on behavior, all we have is what people are saying. I'm thinking we're not comparing. We cannot talk about the people, half of our sample, 40 people, being people of color. There's a lot of differences between who these people are, and the numbers are too small to be able to talk about in what ways do the various subgroup compare. But we know that whites in general are embracing this language of diversity and want to see a lot of proximity between their world and the world of people of color they go to school with, their neighbors, etc. So I don't know if I'm addressing the question, but that's what I'll say for now. Right now, I must say, I just forget in what ways the two groups are different.
Well, Joe says thanks, so I assume that it was addressing his question. Philip and Sebastian, you've both had your hands up for a while, so I'll just come to you now. Philip, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, and thank you for that really interesting talk. And I liked the research design. And I noticed with the foundations, I couldn't help but think of previous literature about how these foundations in the USA in the past often worked to sort of de-radicalize the movements they worked with. And I was wondering if you could comment about that, because it also made me think of, say, Black Panther, how the discourse on the left was that the villain of Black Panther was actually the good guy because he was fighting against the white CIA agent who was helping the hero of the piece, who was, part of empire and all that. And so the ways in which perhaps even within marginalized groups, certain voices aren't recognized and are sort of erased or delegitimized. If you could comment on that, thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the end of your sentence? There's a lot of noise next to me.
Okay, from Black Panther?
Yeah, you said that they were criticized for de-radicalizing.
So I read, like from, say, the so-called dirtbag left, or like some feeds of, say, Black Socialists of America on Twitter, some people wrote and argued that I forgot the villain's name, was the hero because he was an anti-imperialist. The CIA didn't like him. He was coming to take over Wakanda to like liberate.
Tell them not to do this here. Sorry.
And so I was just wondering about how those kinds of radical voices are sometimes marginalized or erased or not recognized, either through the foundations or Hollywood getting involved in these spaces of sort of recognizing marginalized groups. I don't know if it's exactly the same as I said it before, but more or less.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit like an infinite regress, right? Regress. Everyone wants recognition. And by definition, if you shed light on one group, those that are not being discussed will feel that they're made invisible. So, ideally, how do we deal with this? By, acknowledging that different groups will be highlighted over time, a notion of taking turn, a notion of conspicuous effort. I think when it comes to foundation, they differentiate. I mean, it also operates as an organizational field, right? They differentiate themselves from each other by having their pet projects. So one very important and wonderful organization is called Color of Change, and their goal is to bring to get more African Americans to be to vote and to have a voice in politics, and to force politicians to address their concern, including, issues of racial justice. And they want to be visible in the field of foundations that they, in Baudrillardian term, compete with each other. So I guess my response would be something like, maybe it's Pollyannish to say, let 100,000 flower bloom, as opposed to comparing how much visibility X group receives in relation to Y group. And that if you focus on the short term, many groups have good reasons to complain about misrecognition, but the arc of history is going toward greater recognition on many dimensions. And this is ultimately what the book is going to be about. And what do you think? Do you think such an answer is?
I agree with you generally that even in spite of what it can sometimes look like, the arc is generally towards recognition and justice. It's just obviously some foundations don't want like radical environmentalists or feminists or anti-racist voices heard and use their money to leave them out. But I think they can't be ignored forever. So I would agree, yes.
Yeah, but the book will shed light on the fact that there is this huge sector now called social justice philanthropy that has emerged as extremely dynamic and is mobilizing a lot of millennials who are inheriting fortunes and that want to use their resources to support Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And it's not a fringe movement anymore, in part because of the resources that have become available to them, just like, representations of diversity has become in some ways very mainstream. So
we've just got around 5 minutes. Sebastian, you've been wanting to ask a question for a while. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I will try to do it as brief as possible. Thank you, Michèle Lamont. This was a very interesting talk. I was thinking, how do we make more complex a sociology of recognition? Because in Axel Honneth's concept, it at least has 3 levels, right? That here distinguishes as love, rights, and solidarity, or interpersonal relationships, institutional recognition, and civic recognition. And I think this relates somehow to what you said, like the relationship between kindness and justice. But at the same time, it seems to me that your concept of recognition doesn't theorize or doesn't account for these different dimensions, or how these different planes of recognition can be out of phase or can develop out of joint, right? Some people can say like, yeah, I recognize them the right to get married, but not close to me, right? So then you have different structures of recognition at the same time that structures of misrecognition, right? So I also think that it would be interesting to think how different structures of recognition deal with different expressive mediums of culture. Narratives can be more suited, for instance, for interpersonal recognition. But once we move towards other institutional settings, we probably need other ways of conveying meaning. And my second question is that when you talk about the scripts of the self, I couldn't but think about Charles Taylor and sources of the self. And I was thinking, to what extent do you see your work on scripts on self somehow addressing the idea of a constitutive tension of modernity between a self that is instrumental, punctual, buffered, discipline, and a self that strives for contact with the world, with nature, with itself? And if you see such a connection, what do you think your work tells us about this stage of modernity? Because something that I'm missing in a lot of sociology is this kind of high order reflections about what is modernity about, that I think Durkheim had, Max Weber had. And I think that when we talk about the scripts of the self and we see these things as constitutive of modernity, we can recover that kind of high order discourse. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wow, this is a very, very good question. Well, 2 questions. I feel like my book is very much a 2020 book, and modernity is quite old by now. So it's not a historical project, but it's true that, I'm Canadian and I probably should revisit Charles Taylor at this point. I've always been a little bit annoyed that, in fact, a lot of the inspiration of what he writes about is Quebec. It's French Canadian, and part of me feels like he doesn't really do justice to the dimensionality of the Quebec case, the French Canadian case, and also the emotional dimension. And it's a very it's South Africa in many ways. It's a society that is, and it's not as obvious to people who don't know the society about how deeply insulated the two communities are. And he's part of it. He's part of the McGill world, and the connections with the French Canadian worlds are extremely weak. So part of me has always wanted to engage him on these things, and I don't know if we ever will. But anyway, thank you for your comments. I will revisit the book and think more about this, as well as your question about the Excel Annette conceptualization. I've always found, it's hard to grapple with them empirically. I feel like my approach, what I've tried to do in this project and in the paper addressing the recognition gap, is really to try to translate some of his questions into empirical questions. I feel like the empirical agenda of the sociology of recognition, it was really underdeveloped, and that's where I wanted to do the work. And I know that a lot of people now in the UK some people at least, are working on this, and I have yet to do the work of reading more closely what is being done there to see what are the parallels. I'm really, as you can see from my presentation, in the weeds when it comes to, working out how things are operating at the empirical level. But I'll come back to your questions and think about them. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone, for all of these questions. Just to close the discussion, Michèle, I'll be really interested to hear about what the process is like to be kind of writing a book that's for potentially different kinds of audiences to who you're typically writing for. How have you found that process?
It's been difficult. I signed this contract, and it's a big contract, and it's very scary because I think, wow, I better write a good book. And most of us, I've rarely given much thought to my audience in my previous book. My audience was always my peers. And since I knew what conversations were happening in my intellectual world, it was not hard to know what questions to address. Whereas I think transitioning toward writing a book for a wide audience has been far more complicated than I expected. I had to give myself the permission to reconnect with the lover of writing in me, and give myself the freedom to write much more metaphorically and much more freely. But that's where the interviews have become extremely useful, because as you can see, when I talk about the respondents, a lot of them are truly fascinating. And I think being able to anchor the book in descriptions of what these people do and try
Yeah, I'm sure I will. So thank you so much for coming and for giving this talk to our department as part of the seminar series. It was a great way to close this term seminar series, and we just wanted to say thank you again for coming along. It was really great.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great. And I'm sorry I cannot meet all of you in person. If you have other suggestions or things that you think I should be engaging with, please don't hesitate. Write to me. I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Dan, and take care, everyone. Take care, Michèle. Thank you so much.